I don't remember what happened when, particularly some of the vets that I work with that are also Koofies will say, I remember it clear as day, and then it wasn't even when it happened, but I had a break in the way that I remember things. And it's your brain protecting you. And when you help somebody with PTSD, what you do is you help them to reconstruct a coherent narrative. You bring order back, and you let them talk about it. You let them say what they remember. You let them work through what's confusing about it. I know that this had to happen after this, but I remember it a different way. You let them start thinking about that a little bit differently. But more importantly, you put them back and you embed them back into their social network. Because when someone, particularly with soldiers, a soldier is traumatized, if you send them home and you just cut them loose, that's not going to help them reconstruct a coherent narrative. You put them back into their unit and you give them an opportunity to work through these things. Even if they're never going back into service or back onto their job, what they were there to do. It lets them bring that order back. It helps them when somebody is traumatized in a family. Once there is a safe family environment, you bring them back to work on that coherent narrative. Now that's a very sterile way to talk about really difficult things. And it's not my particular area of expertise. But what I do know is, and what Judith Herman really brought forth in the last chapter of her book, when you take a group of people and you destabilize them or you traumatize them, they cannot reconstruct a coherent narrative the same way. Because I'm not just affected, but everyone else in my community is going through the same thing. Those rocks, those pillars, those people that I served with, those people that are there still maintaining to help me get back into the natural flow of memories and healing, they're not there because everybody went through it. That's the key difference between a collective trauma and an individual trauma. And it manifests itself in different ways. We may think that we're doing okay, but some different collective symptoms will emerge. So, there's a whole body of research on collective trauma. And it worked really well for my research in Native communities, but it really has benefited from the experiences of people around the globe for a very long time. A few of the areas that were really key were post-slavery Africa, post-slavery United States, post-Holocaust Jewish communities, post-communist communities, particularly areas where there were Russian Orthodox Jews and certain Russian Catholics, and then communism came in and said, no more church, we don't believe in that. And that happened for 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years. A lot of indigenous communities have had researchers come in and look at some of these things. First Nations community, this is an area where First Nations people are leading groundbreaking research because the only people that can understand what happened here are the people that are here. You can send 100 people to come in and do interviews, but when you're embedded in that culture and you want to understand how a culture is traumatized, you read a million books on it. But if you haven't been there and seen those interactions or seen that trauma or seen those perturbations, it's really difficult to describe. The onset of trauma disturbed the inertia of our established processes. It changed the relationships between community members. It reduced their successful strategies. It shifted support from familiar to unfamiliar states, and not just for one person, not just for one family, not just for one neighborhood, but this is for the entirety of including people on both sides, Native people across the entire continent. You want to look at the entirety of the world. You go back in history far enough, and there's some community has been traumatized by another community collectively since the beginning of time. But we're just in a really, I hate to say, fortunate position to be able to analyze it in a way that nobody else has. But because of some of the techniques and the funding and some of our own community-driven and culturally compatible programs, we've been able to offer a lot in terms of looking at what happens. A few things I want to just qualify the idea. These are mostly, I like to really pick on boarding schools, in particular the impact on language, but you can extend this to other forms of colonization. The onset of colonization has been referred to as a fundamentally genocidal occurrence. And George Tinker is a native author and researcher. He writes extensively about what are called deep structures. And the gist of his argument is, as a community maintains its stability, it develops these deep structures that are that anchor, that root. They are the values that persist. Even when there's crazy things happening around you, there are these things that are permanent. He calls them deep structures. This process of education has also been referred to as a conversion of the heart by Peterson and Pierce. I love this idea. Conversion of the heart. They're not just trying to change the way you learn or talk. It was an attempt to change the way that you feel. Everything about you, down to your core, that deep structure for each individual. It was an attempted conversion of the heart. Zellner, who wrote a lot about cultural trauma, always, in his writing, refers to it as soul damaging. It's not just we disturb this person or this group, but the very root and core of what makes a person is somehow different. It's not just that we took one aspect of it, but for hundreds of years, we did things that changed these foundational aspects of people. Eduardo Duran calls it soul wounding. Same thing, he's got two really great books on post-colonial psychology and therapy with American Indians. Really great books. Norris and Thompson, who wrote a lot about community resilience, talk about adaptive capacities. It breaks down people's adaptive capacities. If you damage those deep structures, those foundational things that make you a human being, they stop like adaptive capacities from letting you be resilient. And then Harvey referred to it as an attack the ecological sense of identity. Identity is made up of all kinds of things: language, culture, sense-making, knowledge creation, community. And if you take any of those out, it breaks that ecosystem down. These are really, there's another group, the Cuban and Company out of University of Michigan, who have studied trauma in Native families extensively over long periods of time. If anyone is interested in some of those very specific studies, I'd be more than happy to forward those things on. But it all fits under this idea of fundamentally changing something. And it's not just the way they do business. Most people, when they talk about colonization, it's kind of this economic process where there's resources and then one group comes in and takes control of the resources or sets up some kind of a system to pull those resources out. So in most cases when you talk about colonization, you're talking about empires and satellite communities or dependency theory or whatnot. But there was another really bright native researcher that came along and said, let's think about this differently. Let's think about this in terms of soul wounding, soul damaging, conversion of the heart, these foundational aspects.